When you live in a small rural town, land is more than just property, it's your history, your livelihood, and your peace of mind. That's exactly why I wasn't about to let some HOA board, especially one run by Karen, try to dictate what I could or couldn't do with my creek. My family had owned this land for nearly a century, and that narrow ribbon of water flowing through the back pasture wasn't just a pretty stream, it was a vital water source for livestock, irrigation, and the little ecosystem that kept our soil healthy. But Karen, the self-appointed queen of the HOA, never cared about history or rights. To her, the creek was an unsightly ditch that attracted mosquitoes and weeds. She had been complaining for months during board meetings, twisting the story until she convinced a handful of homeowners that my creek was some kind of community hazard. Then, without warning, I woke up one morning to the rumble of trucks and the unmistakable sound of concrete mixers. My stomach dropped as I ran to the backfield and saw workers in bright vests, under Karen's watchful eye, pouring wet cement directly into the flowing creek. She stood there smugly, arms crossed, like she had just solved world hunger. I shouted for them to stop, waving my arms in disbelief, but she raised a stack of papers, claiming it was an HOA-approved drainage improvement. My blood boiled as I watched decades of natural waterway get destroyed in a matter of hours. I knew instantly that this wasn't just Karen overstepping her power, this was sabotage. And deep down, I also knew something she hadn't even considered. Nature has a way of fighting back, and Karen was about to learn her basement wasn't as safe as she thought. The morning after the cement incident, I walked down to the creek to survey the damage. What had once been a crystal-clear stream flowing peacefully through my land now looked like a construction dump site. The water was blocked, diverted awkwardly, by a thick wall of drying concrete that spread like a scar across the bed. Fish that had swum freely for decades were gasping in shallow pools where the water could no longer circulate. I could feel my blood boil, not just from the senseless destruction, but from the sheer arrogance it took for Karen and her little army of HOA volunteers to step onto my property and vandalize it in broad daylight. I snapped photos of everything, careful to document not just the creek but also the leftover bags of cement mix that were still sitting by the edge, complete with store receipts stuffed into one of the torn plastic wrappers. Karen wasn't just careless, she was sloppy. When I confronted her later that day, she acted as if I was the unreasonable one. Standing on her porch, arms crossed with that smug grin she always wore, Karen said, "It's called community improvement. That creek runs through our subdivision too, and we decided it needed to be filled. Too many mosquitoes. Too much flooding risk." Her voice was dripping with fake authority, like she thought quoting some nonsense about community standards would excuse trespassing and environmental destruction. I laughed in disbelief. "Karen," I said, holding up my phone with the pictures, "that creek is entirely on my property line. It feeds into my cattle troughs, and now you've cut off the only natural water source these animals have. You've damaged ecosystems, private land, and state-controlled water rights. Do you have any idea what you've done?" Instead of backing down, she doubled down, waving her hand like I was some nuisance. "Oh, stop being dramatic. Cement fixes everything. If you want water, put in a hose. This is bigger than your little farm, it's about the neighborhood's vision." That's when I knew Karen wasn't just ignorant, she was dangerous. She believed her HOA bylaws somehow overruled state law, private ownership, and even basic common sense. And in her arrogance, she hadn't noticed what was already happening behind her house. The same creek she filled ran downhill into her own backyard before curving across mine. With the water blocked at my property line, pressure had been building all night. By the time I walked her back to her porch and pointed to her basement windows, she gasped. A steady stream of muddy water was trickling down the slope and pooling against her foundation. Cracks in her cement wall oozed with moisture. Her basement sump pump was already running non-stop, whining like a dying engine. She turned pale as she realized the mess she'd made wasn't just my problem at Washers. "Think that cement was a good idea now?" I asked, my voice calm but sharp as a blade. She didn't answer. For once, Karen had no snide remark, no HOA regulation to throw in my face. She just stared as the water line crept higher against her basement wall, the irony sinking in faster than the water itself. By the third day, the situation had spiraled into something out of a movie. The cement Karen and her HOA crew had dumped into my creek had hardened into a jagged wall that completely blocked the flow of water. With nowhere else to go, the stream carved a new path, and unfortunately for Karen, that path cut straight through the slope leading into her backyard. Every passing hour, more water pressed against her house, seeping through cracks and invading her basement. What started as a small trickle became a full-on flood, transforming her finished basement into a muddy pool that smelled like damp earth and fish. Carp and trout, desperate for survival, followed the redirected water and flopped into the rising pools inside her home, swimming beneath overturned furniture as if the place had become an aquarium exhibit. I stood on the edge of her yard, watching as city inspectors and a flood mitigation crew rushed in, their boots sloshing through ankle-deep water. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Karen had turned my creek into her personal fish tank, and the sight was almost too poetic to believe. I overheard one of the inspectors mutter, "Who in their right mind fills a natural waterway with cement?" Karen, red-faced and sputtering, tried to defend herself with the same rehearsed excuse: Descuidos, HOA authority, community improvement, but no one was buying it. Her neighbors, many of whom had quietly resented her pushy HOA antics for years, stood at the edge of the property, whispering, some even recording the spectacle on their phones. While Karen scrambled, I was busy filing official complaints. I had already contacted the County Water Authority, the Department of Environmental Quality, and even the local news station. Each agency reacted with the same disbelief and outrage. Blocking a natural creek wasn't just reckless, it was illegal. She had violated state water rights, trespassed on private land, destroyed protected ecosystems, and now created a public hazard. The fines alone could bankrupt a small business. And Karen had done it in broad daylight, with witnesses, photos, and receipts to prove it. But the real sting for Karen came when her insurance company arrived to assess the basement damage. The adjuster, a tall man with a clipboard and a tired look, shook his head almost immediately. "This isn't a natural flood," he said bluntly. "This is self-inflicted property damage. You poured cement into a live creek. That's negligence. Plain and simple. We're not covering this." The look on Karen's face when she heard that was priceless, equal parts fury, disbelief, and the dawning realization that she was on her own. Standing on my porch that night, I could see the flashing lights from the cleanup crew still working in her yard. The hum of water pumps echoed through the neighborhood. For once, Karen's house wasn't the pristine model home she bragged about at every HOA meeting. It was a disaster zone. And while part of me felt a twinge of pity for her family, the larger part of me couldn't ignore the justice in it. All she had tried to destroy my creek, my land, my livelihood. Instead, she had destroyed herself. The chaos in Karen's basement was only the beginning. By the following week, the legal storm she had unleashed came crashing down harder than the floodwaters ever had. The County Water Authority filed immediate injunctions against her, ordering her to remove every ounce of cement from the creek and restore the waterway to its natural state. Environmental inspectors documented everything: dead fish, destroyed habitats, erosion along the creek banks, and slapped her with violations that carried staggering fines. Karen's voice, once so commanding in every HOA meeting, was reduced to a desperate, trembling tone as she begged officials to give her more time. But time wasn't her ally anymore. Meanwhile, her neighbors had grown bold. What had once been whispered complaints about Karen's bullying tactics and endless fines suddenly erupted into loud accusations. At the next emergency HOA meeting, dozens of homeowners gathered, not to support her but to confront her. They demanded explanations, demanded accountability, and demanded she resign as president. One man shouted, "You've been treating us like pawns for years, Karen. Now look where your arrogance has gotten you." All over the news. The local station had run a segment titled "HOA President Turns Creek into Cement Disaster," and the footage of her basement fish tank had already gone viral online. I didn't even need to say much. The evidence spoke for itself. The HOA's attorney had already reached out to me, trying to negotiate some kind of settlement, but I wasn't in the mood to cut deals. Karen hadn't just trespassed. She had threatened my property value, my water rights, and the fragile ecosystem that made my land special. When I showed up to the county courthouse with my file of photos, videos, and expert statements, the judge's eyebrows shot up. "This is one of the most reckless acts I've seen from a private homeowner in years," he said, his gavel slamming down as he denied her request for leniency. But the true irony hit when Karen's own HOA turned on her. Facing public humiliation, the board stripped her of her position and voted her out unanimously. The same people she had lorded her authority over now avoided her calls and emails, treating her like a liability rather than a leader. Even her closest allies abandoned ship, fearing they would be dragged down with her. The woman who once bragged about running the neighborhood couldn't even get a seat at her own HOA table anymore. And still, the creek flowed on its way back to life through the cracks in the cement, mocking her every effort to control it. Engineers told her the cleanup could cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, maybe more, depending on how deep the damage went. The fines stacked on top of that, plus lawsuits from neighbors who blamed her for lowering their property values, meant Karen's financial ruin wasn't a possibility anymore, it was a certainty. From my porch, watching the crews rip out chunks of cement under the hot sun, I couldn't help but marvel at the balance of it all. Karen had tried to control nature, control people, control everything she touched. But nature pushed back harder, and justice followed in its wake. By the time the final judgment came down, Karen was a shell of the woman who once strutted through the neighborhood with clipboards and threats. The court ordered her to personally fund the creek's restoration, a project estimated at nearly $1.2 million after environmental engineers factored in the contamination cleanup, the reintroduction of native fish species, and the stabilization of the banks she had destabilized with her cement stunt. On top of that, she was hit with fines from the Environmental Protection Agency, the county, and civil lawsuits from 5 separate neighbors who claimed her actions had devalued their properties. The combined total was staggering, far more than her home, her retirement fund, or even her entire HOA could cover. The irony was brutal. The woman who poured cement into a creek now had debt poured over her life, layer by crushing layer, until there was no escape. Reporters continued covering the story, and the phrase "fish tank basement" became a running joke across social media. Memes circulated of Karen standing in scuba gear in her living room, or of the HOA signboard plastered with "closed due to flood." Every time she tried to silence the mockery, it only spread further. What had once been her source of power at the HOA had washed its hands of her, officially filing paperwork that banned her from holding any future leadership role. She wasn't just dethroned, she was erased. For me, justice didn't come with gloating or revenge speeches, it came with the quiet sight of the creek slowly healing. The first time I saw minnows darting through the clear water again, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. Nature has a way of bouncing back, stronger than the arrogance of any one person. My sister brought her kids to the creek one afternoon, and they splashed in the shallows as if nothing had ever happened. That was my victory, not Karen's downfall. But the restoration of what she tried to destroy. Karen, meanwhile, couldn't escape the consequences. She sold her SUV, then her jewelry, then finally her house, just to keep up with the avalanche of bills and lawsuits. Rumors spread that she moved into a cramped apartment 2 counties over, hiding from the very neighbors she once lectured and fined. No one missed her. If anything, people celebrated her absence as a chance to rebuild the neighborhood into something less toxic, less controlling, and far more united. In the end, Karen's story wasn't about a creek or a basement, it was about hubris, about how one person's hunger for control can blind them to the forces bigger than themselves. She thought she could bend nature, people, and even the law to her will. But nature doesn't negotiate, neighbors don't forget, and the law doesn't forgive. And so, the creek still flows. Steady and untamed, a living reminder that no matter how much cement you pour into the world, some things can never be buried.